Good day, people out there, and robots, and everyone else. This is Philosophy Roulette 74, where we read some philosophy papers, and we comment on them as we are going. So, let's have some fun. Let's look at stuff. All the cool stuff. See, this is what I mean by AI in society. They're always putting stuff out. So, what language am I reading here? This is a Spanish. Or is this Italian? Bene, rotunda e globosa veritas. Argument and computation? What does that mean? Let's take a look at their papers. Don't know what this is. Not even abstract to look at. No proxy. So maybe some open access thing? Benchmark and abstract argumentation. Yeah, I don't know if I can read this because it's about computer models. Yeah. Well, this looks like might be some interesting work. Like they're modeling argumentation. Yeah, because we got benchmarks here and frameworks and different things. Okay, that looks like a cool project, like a cool journal, but not really something I can read. AJP, grounding the myth of ontological innocence. The problem with AJP is their minimum word count is basically the limit of what I could actually read on air in a reasonable amount of time. Yeah, 29 pages. I'd love to read an AJP article, but it would take like 2 hours. Wilson, I was gonna say Wilson to Wittgenstein. Wilson to Wittgenstein. Let's take a look at that. 1 through 10. What do we got? Not accessible. Oh. Okay, this is a review. Analytic philosophy and the decline of Wittgenstein. Too long to read. All this stuff. Let's see. I read this stuff out, so I already looked at this Happy Fish. That was a cool paper, though, this Happy Fishing. Alright, so let's see if we can find something different to read. Let's go back. You know, I'm looking at all this stuff. Epic. I've not looked at Epoche. Epoche might be an interesting thing to look at. Historical philosophy. So 13 pages. Marian Nihilism and the Gifted. Eros in Mind. How to Speak Kata Fusin. Okay, that's interesting. So we've got... This is only 11 pages. We can take a look. Oh, no. Yeah, I don't think I have access to these things. That's sad. I should get access. Someone should give me access. Someone give me access. I'll go log into... Proclus and self-predication. I'm talking right now. Urgh. Why, people? Heraclitus and the Riddle of Nature. Is that like the Riddle of Steel? I wonder if that is. What is the Riddle of Steel, boy? I'll tell you. Thinking, aporia. Alright, I'm not liking this journal, mate. The journal is very good. I'm sorry, but your authors do not upload their papers, so it makes me sad. Argentness, we looked at an Argentness paper yesterday. It was on Monty Hall problem, and it made me all grumpy because I'm like, I don't think this is the right application of, right understanding of the Monty Hall problem. Which I enjoy, actually. I like having something to say. It's like, that's a good thing when I have something to say. Or at least I think I have something to say, actually. That's really cool. Hypatia. Have not looked at a Hypatia journal. Let's paper. I don't know about their word count in Hypatia. Okay, so that is 10 pages. Beyond Science Wars. Feminist philosophy of science is trustworthy science criticism. Why should they be more trustworthy than anyone else? I don't know. Let's find out. Awesome. I like you people. 14 pages, double spaced. That is so doable. So your paper's getting read. Okay, there. Beyond Science Wars. So if you are joining me live anytime, you can type exclamation point paper in the chat box, and you will show the link to this page here, and you can just do what I just did, find it on Scholar, and it will get you to this page. Cool. Okay, here we go. We're not going to abstract, although that has bit me in the butt a few times now. Introduction. Speaking with Joop de Vries for Science in October 2017, Bruno Latour resists the characterization of sometimes heated debates over science studies, in which he himself figured prominently, as science wars, while allowing its accuracy for more recent events. Nothing that happened during the 90s deserves the name war. It was a dispute caused by social scientists studying how science is done and being critical of this practice, Latour says. We're in a totally different situation now. We are indeed at war. De Vries, 2017. De Vries, yeah. Sorry, I was watching The Witcher, and they had a character called De Vries, I think. Teacher was named De Vries. De Vries persists, calling both conflicts wars, though throughout the interview, Barb's narrative is too hard to resist. Bruno Latour switching sides in the science wars, science critics turn science defender, yet Latour makes for an unruly apostate. There was some juvenile enthusiasm in my style, he allows. It was certainly not anti-science, although I must admit it felt good to put scientists down a bit. Well, people get all too big for the britches. Or as he similarly observes in October 2018 profile in the New York Times, I think we were so happy to develop all this critique because we were so sure of the authority of science. Latour affirms the importance of rebuilding trust in science while resisting description of climate change as just fact, and unlike his friend and ally Clive Hamilton, he would not have us rebuild trust in science by reframing it from questioning or criticizing it. Yeah, I mean, what's the model of strength here? If you can't question or criticize something, then you get dictators. If you get like fascists and stuff. But there's a question of exactly how that works. It's political and sociological. If not strategic positivist, deference to science, what critical stance is open to science studies scholars today that differentiates them from climate denialists and merchants of doubt? For his part, Hamilton rejects postmodernist and constructivist scholars as at best ill-equipped to encounter denialism, and at worst aiding their cause. After March for Science in April 2017, Nora McKendrick asked whether sociologists of science can defend science without compromising their scholarly ideals. In response to McKendrick, Owen Woolley describes himself and other sociologists of science as in a pickle. Excuse me. We have made it our life's work to question objectivity, to illuminate the ways in which science is shaped by extra scientific concern, and to catalog science's problems dealing with power. But if the alternative is Trump, if a choice must be made, count me among the scientists marching. Yeah, this is the worry that you go to just people who are ignore science then, or ignore it as they want. With this most recent anti-science turn, should philosophers and other science study scholars put criticism aside and join the scientists in they study in circling the wagons, or is there a role for critical scholarship that questions or challenges scientific practices and institutions? For Woolley, threading the needle between supporting science and studying it presents a new and urgent challenge. Our program has been to take science down a peg by showing how it fails to live up to its own ideals, but we have done less to articulate what those ideals should be, or what kind of expertise might warrant our support. Future endeavors should look into this systematically, but the urgency of the moment cannot wait. To rise to the present challenge, we must cobble something together. Yeah. It's like, what have we done? Oh my god. This is our fault. It is not the academics' fault. Very rarely the academics' fault. Giving yourself too much credit if you think this was some like people arguing in the 90s over what science is, the current state of the world. Yeah, no. But I do not think we need to cobble something together. Post-positivist feminist philosophers of science have been here before, not so long ago. The naturalized approach taken by Alison Wiley, Lynn Nelson, and others, which Christian Intiman has characterized as feminist standpoint empiricism, is particularly instructive. As Wiley wrote in The Engendering of Archaeology 20 years ago, given political and conceptual commitments that make corrosive hyper-relativism as uncongenial as unreflective objectivism, feminists have been exploring positions between or beyond these polarized alternatives. Feminist philosophers of science, grounding their analyses in a detailed understanding of scientific practice, are neither deferential to science nor antagonistic in a war on science, but they do stand in a distinct relationship to science, and taking a cue from feminist care ethics, I take this relationality as significant. How is this best described? If not merchants of doubt, are feminist philosophers scientific gadflies, or perhaps scientific loyal opposition? Though these notions might underwrite useful approaches for science studies, neither of them captures the distinctive interdependency and interestedness of feminist philosophers of science towards their object of inquiry. I think we would be well served by understanding the post-positivist feminist philosophy of science as an exemplar of trustworthy science criticism, building here upon the analysis of trust and trustworthiness by Annette Baer, among others, particularly well attuned to the dynamics of interdependency in trust relationships. Okay, let's find out. Why not refrain from questioning science? Hope everyone had their coffee today. If you are a coffee drinker, tea to the people in England, in India, I guess, China, and everywhere else. Before turning to the virtues of post-positivist feminist philosophy of science as a model for trustworthy science criticism, let's consider some possible reasons to refrain, and conversely not refrain, from questioning science during wartime. And notice the militaristic rhetoric that carries through here. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. We must oppose the climate denialism and other anti-science movements by any means necessary, or so says this particular line of reasoning. Even granting the opposition of science studies to climate denialism and the wisdom of this platitude, there remains the problematic assumption that we should not question or challenge our friends. Yet the most that follows here is the query and critique should be done in good faith, with goodwill towards the scientists and attending scientific work, practices, and institutions, questioned and engaged, which is to say, as an approach to questioning science that is compatible with and actively grounded in trustworthy relationality. Okay, 2. One cannot fight on two fronts. Although peacetime might allow for questioning science, this line of reasoning grants we cannot afford the luxury of questioning science given the simultaneous challenge posed by anti-science forces. Some working scientists might take themselves to be under attack in such a way. Yet this line of reasoning commits an error that is complementary to the previous one, as we need not refrain from questioning our friends. Questioning science need not put us in antagonistic opposition to scientists or their work. Here is one more way in which militaristic framing of science wars privileges one reading and closes off others of the relation between scientists and science studies scholars. You see, yeah, it does privilege this. It's an interesting question. What is exactly privileged in this reading, the militaristic reading? Because it definitely protects the science, but what aspect of the science is being protected then? Number 3. Save our powder. We should limit the. We should use the limited time or resources spent questioning science and stuff in itself instead. Questioning science instead for questioning and criticizing climate denialists and other anti-science movements. The primary driver for this line of reasoning is opportunity cost. And certainly some of the best work in science studies in recent years has squarely engaged with manufactured doubt from secondhand smoke to climate change. Yet Latour would rightly remind us that these projects are not mutually exclusive. They might even not even be different projects, as when critical engagement with climate science builds the hermeneutical resources needed to critically engage climate denialism as well. Recall also Latour's suggestion that the best way to rebuild public trust in science is to demythologize scientists and their work. The argument that we should question science denialism rather than science presumes a rather clear demarcation between science and science denialists, which overlooks the problem of hyperextended expertise as credentialed and seemingly credible scientists adopt an authoritative pose on issues beyond their disciplinary expertise. This is always a problem. Everyone's always talking. They get to be fancy in something, and then like experts, and then they talk about something that they shouldn't be talking about, something they're not expert in, and you're just like, I mean, this happens all the time because people get impressive credentials and then they say something about philosophy and I facepalm. And I'm just like, why? And it's like, don't talk about philosophy. You don't know what you're talking about. It's much harder than you think. You don't get free philosophy credentials by doing something else fancy any more than I get like free doctor credentials because I read some philosophy. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's crazy. Finally, this line of reasoning seems to presume that to be an object of study is to be undermined or delegitimized, that is, science criticism as entirely negative enterprise. This may be an understandable reaction when critics approach their work as taking science down a peg, but this is not the only critical stance open to us. Was it bullet point 4, I guess, or something? Give no aid to the enemy. Even if unintended, might questioning sciences bolster climate denialism and other anti-science forces. This seems to be Hamilton's worry about postmodernism in science studies and public's understanding of science. Even if this is cause for concern, however, it is less a reason to refrain from questioning science than as a reason to do it well. My suggestion is that post-positive feminist philosophy of science shows us a particularly fruitful way of doing it well. Bullet point next. The inadequacy of reasons to refrain. If we take questioning and critically engaging science as a default position for science studies, then sufficiently compelling reasons to refrain must be provided in order to warrant a change. If merchants of doubt and climate denialists are unaffected by science studies scholarship, this could underwrite a deflationary argument for the default position. We might also worry that strategic essentialism or positivism might backfire and thereby strengthen anti-science rhetoric. But my argument for trustworthy science criticism does not take either of these approaches. I agree with Latour that questioning science is important for rebuilding trust, but I also want to affirm the symmetry of that position, that is, to affirm the value of trustworthy science criticism for science, as well as the value of trustworthy science for society. Okay, so this is the setup on the why not refrain from, why not hold back. So these are all the sort of counter arguments to why, for quietism basically in science studies. And so this is the argument against quietism here as motivation for the position now to be given. Yep, so. Trustworthiness as a critical stance. My suggestion, which is not a novel insight so much as a timely reminder, is that trustworthy science criticism is a methodological stance that avoids the presumptive dichotomy between challenging science and defending it, and post-positivist feminist philosophy of science offers a good exemplar for trustworthy science criticism in action. This is not to say that trustworthy criticism is the only methodological stance available to differentiate one's work from merchants of doubt or normatively inappropriate dissent. In general, consider the loyal opposition in parliamentary systems of government, like trustworthy science criticism, A loyal opposition is built on a recognition that serious disagreement can be coupled with shared commitments, such as the commitment to representative democracy and procedural justice. You know, there is a problem with this. I heard once, and it's a mutual legitimation system. It's not a mutual loyal opposition. Is you mutually legitimate each other by having an argument, but it doesn't really mean that it's by mutually legitimating each other. That may just make you either you're both of these bad sides are legitimating each other, making the whole system seem good, but it's still all bad. So it's a very dangerous argument to use government as an example of legitimacy, because if it's all a charade anyway, and it's like the two sides are arguing, but without any real benefit, then it's not actually a. It has to be, of course, a good argument. It can't just be in bad faith. But yeah, this is a good point. If it is a good argument, but then you have to tell what a good argument is as opposed to just a mutual legitimation system. Okay. Second, another critical stance in this conceptual space between simple defense and outright hostility is the anarchist approach by Paul Feyerabend, who adopts the role of a pesky but useful gadfly to science, not to distract or detract from science, but to generate the productive conflict and tension necessary for progress. There's always a question of, do you actually need tension for progress? It is sort of a myth that, or mythology, I don't know if I want to say myth, that we need something to spur us into action. But the truth is, there's always something to spur us into action. Do we actually need to generate problems for this to happen? And why should we think we're any better than the outside world for causing ourselves problems? We cause ourselves enough problems anyway, so does the world. So why do we need to be a gadfly? That's sort of what got Socrates killed. So, though interesting and possibly worthwhile stances, neither of these are entirely align with trustworthy criticism. I think Bayer gives a particularly perceptive account of the nature of trust, starting with the point that trust is crucial and messy. Trust can be placed on us without our consent or even our recognition. It can be morally healthy or corrupt, rational and irrational. Rational trust, Bayer explains, requires good grounds for such confidences in another's goodwill, or at least the absence of good grounds for expecting their ill will or indifference. Making space for normative evaluations allows for a distinction between being trusted and being trustworthy, though the fact that one is not trusted might be some evidence against one's trustworthiness. This account models trust as a three-place relation of entrusting A trust B with C. Trust and trustworthiness, so understood, are not generalized, but standing in a relation to a specific trusting A, the trusted B parties, either of whom may be individuals or groups of agents, and the entrusted objects, C, both material and abstract. This sort of analysis makes space for both reciprocal and non-reciprocal trust relationships. B may or may not trust A with C or something else, as well as self-trust or distrust and self-trustworthiness or untrustworthiness, where A and B are the same party. It also allows for the possibility that trustworthy science criticism can come from either side, or from either outside or within a scientific community. Perhaps most significant in Bayer's identification of trust as a form of dependency distinction from mere reliance. Trust not just as predicting or relying on other steady habits, but relying on their competence and goodwill towards oneself and entrusted objects. Carring-Jones characterizes trust as an attitude of optimism that the goodwill and competence of another will extend to cover the domain of our interaction with her, together with the expectation that the trusted will be directly and favorably moved by the thought that we are counting on her. Paul Faulkner makes a similar point regarding trust in testimony as effective trust. When a listener effectively trusts a speaker's testimony, he expects the speaker to recognize his need to know something, and thus expects the speaker's telling him is done given this recognition of his need to know. Along these lines, we may understand trustworthy science criticism such that the epistemic agent or agents is competent and conscientious in formation and presentation of their critical analyses of science. Genuine trustworthy science studies scholarship is offered not just reliably but conscientiously, sincerely, effectively, responsive to epistemic interdependency, and attendant to successful uptake by trusting parties toward objects of trust. This account of scientific trustworthiness is compatible with Fricker in her characterization of a good informant as someone who will tell us the truth about a proposition at hand, with distinguishing traits of competence, trustworthiness, and indicators both. Competent knowers cannot be good sources if others cannot tell as much, so the informant must evidence her status as a good informant, which is audience oriented in a way that takes seriously the interpersonal dimensions of our specific relationships, such as differential expertise, social location, mutual expectations, and context-sensitive conversational implications. Alright, so it's just saying you're doing it. There's no bad faith here. It's all in goodwill and it's trustworthy, and all these details is good. Okay. So that's the proposal. Between objectivism and hyper-relativism. Feminist philosophers of science stand in interested relationality to science. As Wiley rightly reminds us, feminists have a prima facie interest in the sciences and scientific methods, as in principle a crucial source of just the kind of understanding we need to proceed effectively in the pursuit of our goals of creating a gender equitable world. In her paper Science and Anti-Science, Elizabeth Lloyd systematically and exhaustively responds to critics of feminist science studies, such as Gross and Levitt and Wolpert. Among the many misconceptions of their targets that Lloyd finds in these critics are misattributions of motive and intent. The critics' most profound error is that they have misidentified feminists and social scientists as being overly hostile to science, rather than accepting them as allies who genuinely share their concern and foundational political goals regarding science. So my suggestion is that those seeking a model of trustworthy science criticism as an alternative and corrective to contemporary science denialism need not cobble something together, but instead find it in post-positive feminist philosophy of science explicitly positioned between unreflective objectivism and hyper-relativism. By design, as Nelson and Wiley observed, feminist values and politics are deeply and constructively contrary to relativism, even as feminists also refuse to cede objectivity, empiricism, or evidential assessment to unreflective objectivism. They resist a total reduction of evidential or empirical considerations entirely to political ones. The world pushes back, but also dispute the presumptive dichotomy between factive and value-infused inquiry. The driving goals here are not only negative denigration, but positive identification and promotion of better science, in which is understood not just hypothetically, but in reference to actual exemplars from scientific practice. For example, ungendered practices in archaeology. Lots of references. Although I do take issue with this use of CF. CF is being like substituted for like Viz, which Viz is like specifically. CF means compare. So if these are actually examples of gendered practice in archaeology, you don't use CF, you use Viz. For this reason, naturalism is another distinctive feature, with methodological emphasis on detailed case studies and attention to the details of science in historical context and actual practice. As Nelson and Wiley put it, many feminist philosophers of science are just as firmly committed to naturalized and social programs of research and philosophy of science as they are to feminist modes of inquiry in philosophy. What does this approach have to teach us about questioning science in uncertain times? I would suggest 3 takeaway lessons. Number 1, although there is no number 1 here. Challenging dichotomous thinking and rhetoric. The option for engaging with science are not only deference or delegitimization. While this may seem obvious, considered abstractly, when scientific institutions and values face antagonism, politically influential opposition, it can be difficult to see anything else short of deferential defense. Feminist philosophy has been here before, where the specter of hyper-relativistic critique so rattled some working scientists and self-appointed defenders that multiple approaches to science studies were lumped together in books such as Higher Superstition and A House Built on Sand, in dichotomous framings exposed and pulled apart by Elizabeth Lloyd and Elizabeth Anderson. Values and politics, both relevant and open to critique. A particular form of dichotomous thinking upended by post-positivist feminist philosophers of science is the recognition of values and politics in science. Consider the familiar claim that good science is at least ideally value-free science, accompanied by suspicion and denigration of scientific projects or institutions for failure to stay sufficiently pure, sufficiently value-free, on the assumption that values and politics, any values and politics regardless of specific content, undermine scientific credibility. But rejecting a value-free ideal need not imply that anything goes in terms of guiding values or politics. Indeed, the presumption that it retains the underlying dichotomous thinking. Anderson reminds us that recognition of values or politics as scientifically relevant does not elevate them beyond critical engagement. Bringing together feminist epistemology and ethics, Anderson rejects the presumptive asymmetry that scientific knowledge ought to be generalizable, public and objective, while values are hopelessly subjective. On climate change, for example, she argues that value-forward questions, justice, injustice, accountability and obligation, rights and responsibilities, demand reasoned, reflective investigation as well. If the credibility of scientific claims or institutions is undermined by their value-ladenness, what matters is not the mere fact of value-ladenness, but the specific values themselves, which must be discussed, debated, and defended. Yeah, this is always a problem, exactly where values and politics are in science, because you can't get rid of them. So this is, I think, a very good point, that if you have a good way to talk about them, it bolsters the scientific practice. So I like this point here. I mean, this is not a big... This one, of course, is right too up here, but I think this is a very strong point. Virtues of naturalistic methodology. Post-positivist feminist philosophy of science is generally characterized by methodological commitment to engage with science in practice and in piecemeal, not just abstractly or broadly. In practice and in piecemeal, so it does it bit by bit. Exemplars like Lloyd work on androcentric bias and evolutionary examples of female sexuality, and Wiley's work on gender bias and archaeology derive their force from skilled interactional expertise. The guiding questions of feminist philosophy of science cannot be pursued from philosophical armchairs. The details matter. They are where feminism and empiricism meet. Androcentric science is not merely politically unacceptable, but bad science for its empirical inadequacies, silence on important questions, and thinly justified androcentric premises. Philosophy of science and science studies scholarship taking this methodological tack is better equipped than strategic positivism to expose the inadequacies of manufactureversies. Good job, philosophers, with the words. Another denialist rhetoric. Doubt and uncertainty are not ends in themselves, identifying them as not a cogent stopping point without further argumentation, within which such points serve as initial premises. Denialist rhetoric raising doubts without further argumentation is vulnerable to the sort of careful evidential assessment that feminist philosophers of science have used to great effect in exposing inadequacies of androcentric science. Okay, so I guess this one says that this bit here is that the feminist philosophers of science have had a lot of practice in poking holes in the sort of cruddy arguments of the denialists, I guess, or the anti-science crowd. So they should... looking at this from a argumentative style, this is a basic reason. I liked this one because this one is a big problem and it's going to solve. And then this one is sort of the kicker thing, just to say, and moreover, we're so good at this other stuff up here, we're particularly positioned to hit back. So, as a sort of like a rhetorical build up to the making your point, you put your the standard point first, then like a strengthened point, and then like some sort of strengthened point with like a little kicker, which is this one here at the end. So that makes the argument flow. Yeah. Alright, now we're going to get into some clarifications and concerns. My suggestion then is that We can and often do critically engage with science within trustful relationships such that our work takes the form of trustworthy science criticism, neither deferential nor antagonistic to scientific practice. With Bayer, a three-place account of trust shows the importance not only of reliability but also goodwill, and not only trust among trusting parties but also with regard to that which is entrusted, or objects of trust in this case refer less to material objects and more to scientific practices and their epistemic basis. By this point, I hope it becomes clear how this approach to questioning science is meaningfully different from that taken by merchants of doubt. It is not merely a different intention, but of function and methodology. For post-positivist feminist philosophy of science, uncertainty and doubt are not stopping points for critique. There is no presumption of value-free ideal for good science, whether explicitly endorsed or tacitly assumed in tactical antagonism to insufficiently pure science. For a merchant of doubt, it is not necessarily necessary to provide a pure alternative so long as their object of criticism loses credibility, and merchants of doubt fail to meet Bayer's moral test for trust, which, by contrast, feminist philosophy of science as trustworthy science criticism must certainly prioritize. Recall also that the ideas of scientific gadflies and scientific loyal opposition, neither deferential nor antagonist to science. Like trustworthy criticism, a loyal opposition is predicated on a recognition that significant disagreement is coupled with shared commitments. But the relationship between government and loyal opposition is symmetric in a way that scientists and science studies scholars are not. Today's loyal opposition may be in government after the next election, and vice versa. This is a defining feature of the relationship, as each side knows, and knows that the other side knows. Yes, everyone knows. Generally speaking, science studies is not an opposition, loyal or otherwise, to science. The notion of a loyal opposition to science carries connotations of partisan politics, which may be particularly unhelpful in the contemporary U.S. political context. The point is not to invite a reading of science studies as in loyal opposition to the Trump administration or climate denialist and anti-scientific forces ascendant in the EPA or other government agencies, where the relationality is in question is between science studies and scientists. The notion of loyal opposition might then be misleading. A trustworthy science critic and Feyerabенdian gadfly share a similar outsider positioning, not necessarily of science but engaged with it, and specifically engaged questioning and challenging with the aim of improving it. They also share a principled refusal to accept as given whatever paradigmatic or hegemonic assumptions happen to govern a scientific community or society at a certain time. Yet the gadfly is self-avowed ironic and Dadaist, worth engaging but not especially meant as trustworthy, like a useful trickster coyote, rather than interested into relationality of post-positivist feminist philosophy and science. Yeah, the gadfly can be useful, but I mean it's not trustworthy. But on the other hand, they know that, and they're willing to be sort of kicked to the side. Also, like they have to be able to take their punches. So, in this case, the problem is that when they can't be kicked to the side. When kicking them to the side just pushes them into the other camp that's bad for you, which in this case is the anti-scientist denialist. And I guess that's the danger here, that it's not so much that the gadfly will appear to be in there, is that they will be embraced and celebrated by the anti-science crowd. And that, so, the gadfly model doesn't work when you've got political forces supporting like sort of just the opposition. So then it becomes a political. The gadfly isn't doing it independently to be a gadfly. It's actually, in some sense, it's supporting the opposition party. Okay. To conclude, let us consider 3 questions concerning the possible inadequacies or least implications of this approach. Do scientists actually trust philosophers and science studies scholars? Perhaps they don't, either because they actually distrust... Wait, do scientists actually trust philosophers? I don't think they trust philosophers. I mean, some do, but why would they? Perhaps they don't, either because they actually distrust, don't particularly care, or don't even know about our work. Yeah, I think this is all right. Even if this is so, however, we can be trustworthy and aspire to trustworthiness whether or not we are actually trusted. And even if we are not trusted by working scientists, we can be trustworthy in how we present and direct science criticism to other audiences. Yeah, see, this is a problem with philosophy right now. This is an excellent point, and this is one of the things I am concerned with. How we present and direct science criticism to other audiences. This is the problem of marketing right here. If we are marketing the science for the scientists, they would be overjoyed because they love their science. They think their science is great. And they want everyone else to love their science. That's why they're scientists. They like doing it. They think it's good. So philosophers and people in science studies have to understand this is a marketing problem. We all have this marketing problem. No one knows what the heck philosophers do. If when the scientists wake up one day and they find out everyone is like thinks their science is cool because some philosopher wrote something interesting about their science, they would be so happy. That's how you would get them to read philosophy. That's how you'd actually generate some trust, by not being propagandist, but by showing how the science is interesting and relevant beyond just what the scientist was saying, but in a philosophical sense that has wider reach than the science itself did. Okay, so this is a good point here. How this is like something I think is important. Are philosophers and other science study scholars actually trustworthy? I think I've mentioned before, no, do not be trusting philosophers any more than anybody else. For scientists or various non-expert publics, perhaps we are not, and so scientists are right to refrain from trusting our work. If this is so, however, is perhaps even more reason to aspire and work towards trustworthiness. Yeah, sure. Philosophers are just like everybody else usually. There's not anything. The demystification of philosophy is always a good thing, at least nowadays, because it makes philosophy falls into the same problem with the scientists. It looks like ivory tower, and people are free to ignore it if we're off doing things that no one understands and no one cares about. And I'm guilty of this as anybody else. My stuff I work on, very few people care about. It's like a handful. So, but I do public philosophy also, so I hope people are watching this and like it, and they understand that philosophy is accessible, or can be accessible sometimes, rarely. Should philosophers and other science studies scholars even aspire towards trustworthy criticism? Perhaps we should not. Perhaps our relationship to science should be characterized by clinical detachment or antagonism rather than goodwill or conscientiousness. Alternatively, perhaps we should not because we should be trustworthy to other parties, or it is taken to be at odds with being trustworthy to scientists. Should we even aspire? Look, this goes to the marketing problem. Should we aspire towards trustworthy criticism? Yes, we should aspire to that, but that doesn't mean we have to be blindly trustworthy at that point. I mean, once you establish trust, there is some give and take there. You build up credit, and then once you have this amount of credit, you're allowed to say something and knock yourself down a peg. But then they'll be okay. They're like, well, they're mostly trustworthy, and we still appreciate what they say most of the time. But no one has to agree 100%. So, I mean, this is the purity problem again. These questions cannot be easily dismissed, but nor should they be. I take it that one explanatory and directive strength of post-positive feminist philosophy of science as exemplar for trustworthy science criticism is that it forces these questions of specifying trustworthiness. Yeah, this is a good point. Taking this approach seriously means asking, with whom am I in a relationship of trust or not, and to whom am I or should I be trustworthy or not? It is true that the particular approach to feminist science studies I have been discussing is not positioned against or antagonist to scientists. As Wiley puts it, where feminism is a political perspective based on empirical presuppositions about the way based on empirical presuppositions about the way the world actually is, it is crucial that feminists not reject science as a mode of inquiry. Criticism of androcentric science comes alongside recognition and indeed celebration of good science, which might be done by marginalized individuals or groups not granted the credibility or authority they deserve, but rightly recognized as scientific nonetheless. This approach is well suited for science criticism that looks to illuminate marginalized or ignored knowledge as properly scientific, and less so for science criticism that looks to completely upend the social epistemic status of scientific knowledge altogether. Okay, that's a nice essay. Trying to repair the relationship between philosophers and scientists. That was nicely argued too. I was commenting in the middle how these arguments were built up, bullet point by bullet point, as it were. Well, no bullet points, but like kind of bullet. This sort of like question by question approach. So this is a nicely argued sort of paper. The question is, trust takes a long time and very easy to mess up. So it's like this is a long-term project on building trust, and philosophy has its own trust problem. So you gotta try to maybe this. If I had a criticism for this, it's like you need something real practical, and I don't know the literature here. Maybe there are practical suggestions given by the literature, but like building trust takes a while, and it's very hard to maintain if like in the face of criticism. So it's that's the only thing I really don't know, and it is outside the scope of this paper. So it's not a it's not a criticism of the paper. It's just a question I have going forward. So that's it for now. I'll be back later tonight. I hope you enjoyed this, and of course, suggestions are welcome. If you're still here, please send me something, and have a good day. Thank you. Be safe, everybody.